In 2007, a bridge built in 2005 collapsed, killing 13 people. Meanwhile, a bridge from 1883 still carries traffic its builders never dreamed existed. The Victorian engineers were called paranoid. They were actually prophets. This is the story of how we forgot how to build things that last. Picture this. You're driving down a modern American highway. Smooth concrete stretches ahead of you. Then you see the orange cones, the signs, structural concerns. Bridge closed for emergency repairs. The bridge was built in 2003, 20 years old and already dying from the inside out. Now imagine getting stuck in that traffic and looking across the water at the Brooklyn Bridge. Stone towers rising like cathedrals, steel cables humming under the weight of 150,000 vehicles a day. That bridge opened in 1883 when people still used gas lamps and horses pulled carriages through muddy streets. It's 142 years old, and it's not just standing. It's thriving. It carries loads 20 times heavier than anything John Roebling ever imagined when he designed it. Meanwhile, the concrete bridge next to you, built with modern engineering and computer modeling, is crumbling before it hits middle age. This is the paradox that haunts every structural engineer who studies infrastructure history. Victorian bridges outlast modern ones by a century or more. Not because they had better materials, not because they had computers, but because they had something we lost. A philosophy of building that assumed failure and planned for eternity. What the Victorians called paranoid superdimensioning, we now call the only reason those bridges are still standing. And what we call efficient optimization, they would call a recipe for disaster that's unfolding right now across every highway in America. The Brooklyn Bridge didn't start with confidence. It started with a man everyone thought was insane. John Roebling proposed a suspension bridge across the East River in 1869, at a time when most engineers said it couldn't be done. The span was too long, the forces too complex. The whole thing would collapse under its own weight or tear apart in the first strong wind. Roebling heard all of this and made a decision that defined everything that followed. He would design the bridge not to barely survive, but to massively over-survive. His factor of safety was 6. That meant the bridge could handle 6 times the maximum load it would ever face before anything even started to stress. Other engineers used factors of 2 or 3. They called Roebling's approach wasteful, absurdly over-engineered, a monument to paranoia wrapped in expensive steel. But Roebling wasn't paranoid. He was playing a different game entirely. Most engineers in his era designed for the loads they could see: carriages, pedestrians, the occasional heavy cargo wagon. Roebling designed for the loads he couldn't imagine. He assumed materials would have defects. He assumed his calculations might be slightly wrong. He assumed future generations would use the bridge in ways he couldn't predict. So he built in margins, massive redundant margins. If one cable wire failed, 50 more would hold. If the steel weakened over decades, the bridge would still stand. If traffic got heavier than anyone in 1869 could dream, the structure would shrug and carry it anyway. This wasn't waste. This was wisdom encoded in steel and stone. Then Roebling made the revolutionary choice that guaranteed the bridge's longevity. Galvanized steel cables spun on site. Nobody had done this at scale before. Most bridges used iron chains or cables made elsewhere and shipped in sections. Roebling insisted on something different. Individual wires tested for strength one by one, then woven together into cables 15.75 inches thick right there above the East River. 4 main cables, each one containing over 5,000 individual wires, 14,680 miles of wire total, enough to cross the United States 5 times. Every single wire inspected, every single wire replaceable if it ever failed. The cables weren't hidden inside concrete or sealed away from view. They were exposed, visible, accessible. You could inspect them, you could maintain them. You could replace individual wires without tearing down the whole structure. The bridge was designed to be immortal, not because it would never break, but because when it did break, you could fix it. John Roebling never saw his bridge completed. He died of tetanus in 1869, after a ferry crushed his foot during a site survey. His son Washington took over as chief engineer. Then Washington got caisson disease, the bends, while working in the underwater construction chambers. He was paralyzed, bedridden. For years, he directed construction from his bedroom window through his wife Emily, who became the de facto engineer on site. The human cost of building for eternity was brutal. 14 years of construction, multiple deaths, countless injuries. Workers descending into pressurized caissons under the river, where the compressed air destroyed their bodies. All of this to build something that would outlast everyone involved by more than a century. The Roeblings and their workers were playing the longest possible game. They would never see the bridge at its peak, never know if their gamble paid off. They built it anyway, because they believed in a principle that's almost extinct now. Build once, and build forever. The Victorian philosophy of engineering was fundamentally different from ours. They thought like cathedral builders, medieval craftsmen who laid foundation stones knowing they'd be dead before the spire was raised, knowing their grandchildren would be dead before the final sculpture was carved. The assumption was continuity. You build this, and it joins the permanent landscape. It becomes a feature of the world like a mountain or a river. It has to last, not just for your lifetime, but for lifetimes you'll never see. This required a specific mindset. You couldn't cut corners because you wouldn't be there when they failed. You couldn't optimize too aggressively because you didn't know what future loads would demand. So you overbuilt. You added redundancy. You used factors of safety that seemed absurd. You designed for scenarios that probably would never happen but might. And that was enough. The steel in the Brooklyn Bridge cables illustrates this perfectly. Galvanized coating protects against rust. The cables are exposed, so inspectors can see problems developing. Each wire is independent, so one failure doesn't cascade. Compare this to modern reinforced concrete. Steel rebar buried inside concrete where you can't see it. The concrete protects the steel until it doesn't. Concrete is porous. Water seeps in carrying carbon dioxide. The CO2 reacts with the concrete, creating carbonic acid. This acid eats away the protective alkaline layer around the rebar. Now the rebar rusts. Rust expands. Expanding rust cracks the concrete from inside like a slow-motion explosion. By the time you see cracks on the surface, the damage is catastrophic. The rebar inside has already lost significant strength. This is what engineers call the cancer of concrete. It's invisible until it's too late. And it's killing bridges across America right now. The Victorians didn't have this problem because their approach prevented it. The Brooklyn Bridge cables can be inspected wire by wire. When a wire weakens, you replace it. The structure is designed for this. There's no sealed tomb of concrete hiding corrosion until a bridge collapses. This difference in philosophy is the difference between something that lasts a century and a half and something that fails in 40 years. But we didn't learn this lesson. We forgot it. We decided the Victorians were primitive and we were sophisticated. We had science. We had computer models. We had optimization algorithms that could shave cost and material down to the theoretical minimum. Why waste money over building when you could calculate exactly how much structure you needed? This logic seemed unassailable. It was also completely wrong. The concrete revolution happened after World War II. Reinforced concrete became the material of choice for everything. Bridges, buildings, infrastructure. It was cheap. It was fast. You could pour it into any shape. The promise was that modern material science had eliminated the need for Victorian style overbuilding. Concrete and steel rebar together created a composite material stronger than either alone. Maintenance-free, permanent. Just pour it and forget it. For a few decades, this seemed to work. Then the bridges started failing. The I-35W bridge in Minneapolis was 40 years old when it collapsed in 2007 during rush hour traffic. 13 people died. The bridge had been inspected. Engineers knew there were problems, but the problems were hidden inside the structure where you couldn't see the full extent until it was too late. The Morandi Bridge in Genoa, Italy collapsed in 2018, 51 years old, 43 people dead. Again, the corrosion was hidden inside concrete. Again, inspections miss the severity because you can't see inside a sealed structure without essentially destroying it. These aren't isolated incidents. The American Society of Civil Engineers rates thousands of bridges in the United States as structurally deficient, many of them less than 50 years old. Bridges designed for a 75-year lifespan, failing at 40 or 50 years. The theoretical optimization that looked so good on paper turned out to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Here's what went wrong. Modern engineers designed to code minimums. The code says, you need this much concrete and this much rebar for this load. So you use exactly that much. No more, no waste. Maximum efficiency. This works perfectly if your assumptions are perfect. If the concrete is mixed exactly right. If the rebar is placed exactly where the plans say. If the loads never exceed projections. If water infiltration is zero. If maintenance is perfect and on schedule. If everything goes exactly according to plan forever. But nothing goes exactly according to plan forever. Concrete gets mixed slightly wrong. Rebar shifts during pouring. Traffic gets heavier than projections. Maintenance gets deferred when budgets are tight. And the bridge that was optimized for perfect conditions fails in real conditions. The Victorians didn't have this problem because they assumed imperfection. They assumed mistakes. They assumed their materials would have flaws and their calculations might be off and the future would be different from their projections. So they built in margins, huge margins. 6 times the necessary strength. This wasn't stupidity. This was the only rational response to uncertainty. If you can't predict the future, you have to overbuild for it. If you can't guarantee perfect materials, you have to assume some will fail. If you can't ensure perfect maintenance, you have to design something that tolerates neglect. The Brooklyn Bridge tolerates all of this. It's been neglected for decades at a time. It's carried loads beyond anything in its original specifications. It survived because it was designed to survive worst-case scenarios that never happened and normal scenarios with massive room to spare. The economics of this are fascinating when you look at the full timeline. The Brooklyn Bridge cost $15.5 million in 1883. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $450 million today. A modern equivalent bridge might cost $200 to $300 million. Sounds cheaper, right? But the modern bridge lasts 40 to 50 years before it needs major rehabilitation or replacement. The Brooklyn Bridge has lasted 142 years and is expected to last another century with continued maintenance. Over a 150-year period, the modern bridge needs to be replaced 2 or 3 times. That's $400 to $900 million in today's dollars. The Victorian bridge costs less over time because it was built once and built right. There's another cost nobody calculates. The modern bridge is sealed concrete. When problems develop, you can't repair individual components. You have to do massive structural work, often requiring closing or demolishing and rebuilding sections. The Brooklyn Bridge cables are exposed and accessible. When inspections in 2006 through 2010 found some wires weakening, they replaced those wires. The bridge stayed open. The structure remained sound. Maintenance instead of replacement. Repair instead of demolition. This is only possible because the original design anticipated the need for maintenance and made it possible. Modern bridges are designed like appliances. Use them until they break, then throw them away and buy new ones. Victorian bridges were designed like cathedrals. Maintain them forever because forever is the only acceptable timeline. The symbolic weight of this is crushing when you stand on the Brooklyn Bridge and look around. Tourists photograph the stone towers and the cables while standing on approach ramps made of concrete that's already cracking. The bridge has become a time capsule proving the Victorians right. Every day, 150,000 vehicles cross it. Trucks carrying 40 tons of cargo. Loads that would have been unimaginable in 1883 when the heaviest vehicle was a wagon with a few tons of goods. The bridge doesn't care. The safety margin is so enormous that modern traffic barely stresses it. Engineers study the bridge trying to understand why their calculations say it should be more stressed than it is. The answer is always the same. Superdimensioning. Building in factors of safety so large that even modern loads don't approach the limits. This creates an uncomfortable question for everyone who builds anything today. What else have we optimized into fragility? The same logic that kills bridges early is applied everywhere. Appliances designed to last exactly as long as the warranty. Electronics that can't be repaired, only replaced. Infrastructure built to minimum code requirements with no margin for error. Planned obsolescence isn't just about light bulbs and phones. It's a philosophy that infected everything, including the roads we drive on and the bridges we cross. The Victorians would look at this and call it insanity. Why would you build something designed to fail? Why would you create a system that requires constant replacement instead of occasional maintenance? Why would you confuse efficiency with wisdom? The answer is short-term thinking. Building to last forever is expensive up front. It requires more material, more time, more craftsmanship. The costs are immediate and visible. The benefits accrue over decades and centuries to people who aren't born yet. Our economic system is built on quarterly returns and election cycles. Nobody gets rewarded for spending more now to save money in 2150. The Victorian system was built on dynastic thinking. You spent money now because your grandchildren would benefit. You built things that would last because that's what responsible people did. The shift from that mentality to ours is the shift from cathedral building to disposable construction. And we're paying for it every time a bridge closes or a viaduct collapses. This is the whisper from 1883. The ghost of John Roebling standing on his bridge watching traffic flow. He designed for horses and got Tesla trucks. He designed for thousands of pedestrians and got 150,000 vehicles a day. He designed for failure and got immortality. The cables still hum under load. The stone towers still stand without movement. The bridge refuses to die because it was built by people who understood that paranoia about failure is the same thing as planning for success. They built it once. We're still using it. And every year it stands is another year of proof that they knew something we forgot. The lesson isn't that we should build everything exactly like the Victorians did. It's that we should remember why they built the way they did. Uncertainty demands margin. The future is unknowable, so you prepare for possibilities. Materials fail, so you design for failure. Maintenance gets deferred, so you build things that tolerate neglect. These aren't optional luxuries. They're requirements for longevity. The Brooklyn Bridge will probably outlast most of the bridges built in the past 50 years. Not because of better materials or better engineering knowledge, but because of better philosophy. Build for eternity, and you might get there. Build for minimum code compliance, and you'll get exactly what you designed for. Something that fails right on schedule. Your suspicion was right all along. They really did build things better back then. Not because they had magic or lost technology, but because they built for their great-grandchildren instead of for next quarter's earnings report. The bridge stands as proof. 142 years old and still working. Still strong. Still carrying loads nobody in 1883 could have imagined. The cables sing under traffic. The towers stand unmoved. And every car that crosses whispers the same truth. Sometimes too much is exactly enough. Sometimes paranoia is wisdom. Sometimes the old way wasn't primitive. It was just right.